to turn it over now to Cate Small, who is a current PAM student, and she is going to introduce two of her classmates who are presenting. They are Daniela Liberatore and Cara Gilmore.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I have the pleasure to introduce Cara Gilmore and Daniela Liberatore. Both are TAM students, class of 2024. Cara is from Elon, North Carolina, and did her undergraduate at University of South Carolina. She specializes in UK politics. Dani here is from Rome, Italy, and she did her undergrad at University of Rome and did her undergrad thesis on rule of law in the European Union. Cara is currently at her Bath partner site in the UK and is zooming in with us. And we have the pleasure to have Dani here in person, and she will be heading to Berlin next year. And they will be presenting on Populists and Criminalization. Welcome.
How should we wrap this up?
Sure that was in PowerPoint.
Cara's doing it.
Oh, okay. So I hope everybody can hear me. First of all, thank all of you for being here. And as you can see on the screen, our research paper is about populists and criminalization. So I'm gonna do the introduction and present the first case study, which is going to be Italy, while Cara is going to talk about Hungary, and then she will draw the conclusion. Due to time restrictions, we also focus on other two case studies, but we cannot present it today, and which are Sweden and the US. So in the next slide, I'm going to introduce some basic definition. And for populism, we build on the work of scholars that have defined populism as a political style. So accordingly, they focus on the discursive separation among two uniform antagonistic groups with a strong moral distinction. So on one side, the appeal is on the ordinary people. On the other side is the establishment. Within this context, there is an ideology of popular resentment against the order imposed on society by the established class. The second definition I want to introduce is about criminalization. And with this term, we refer to the act of considering an ideology or a behavior of movement as criminal. And therefore, the authors and participants deserve criminal sanction. Populism has often used rhetoric around security and law and order, to the extent that some scholars have talked about penal populism. Accordingly, the criminal justice establishment has been favoring criminals and prisoners at the expense of crime victims and the law-abiding public in general. So this specific wing of the establishment has nourished this moral distinction between them and the ordinary people. So our paper aimed to examine the link between populism and criminalization. So our broader question is, when populist governments are in power, what are the policies that they adopted? What kind of people get criminalized, and then is the relationship between the narratives of their enemy and the others? We look at the policies that have been adopted by this government, and as I said before, we look at 4 case studies. Our thesis, that is in the next slide, states that populist rhetoric surrounding law and order has tangible policy outcomes, which serve to criminalize and weaken political opposition. And now I'm going to introduce the Italian case. As everybody know, in September 2022, Italy held general elections where the radical right party, Brothers of Italy, won the absolute majority of votes in the parliament. The founder of the party and also the leader of the center-right coalition, Giorgia Meloni, was appointed as prime minister in October. And only 9 days after, the government enacted a provisory law which, among other things, seeks to counter illegal gatherings. Before moving to the content of this law, I want to highlight that provisory law is an exceptional instrument provided by the Constitution for the government to use only in case of extraordinary need and urgency. That's because the law is considered adopted without the consultation of the parliament for a maximum period of 2 months. To give a general idea, this was the main instrument used by the government during the pandemic. The law, which is you can see in the next slide, it's also called. Sorry, can you go to the next? Okay, thank you. The law is also called anti-rave party law. And for the people who don't know what rave party is, it's usually referred to electronic music festival, like dance music that take place at a warehouse or a club. And it's part of the youth culture, and it's usually associated with the use of illegal drugs. However, in Italy, as in some other countries, can also have a political connotation. In the way that involves the occupation of an empty building as a denounce of state inaction, and sometimes can also involve political organization, civil society organization, and also extra parliamentary political groups. As you can see on the screen, the law basically introduced a new type of criminal offense related to an invasion of public and private lands or building. And that is when a musical gathering is organized and results in a concrete danger to public health and public safety. So in this case, organizers, they can be punished by imprisonment from 3 to 6 years, and to the payment of a fine of from 1 to 10,000 euros. To conclude, I want to say that this law has been criticized for its harshness and vague terminology, because I mean, musical or entertainment gathering is really broad, can have a really broad meaning. And it also deserves attention that in the Italian legal system, it is allowed to wiretapping suspects for crime that can carry a sentence over 5 years in prison. So in this case, the organizer could put under surveillance. And therefore, considering the suspension of fundamental rights, some have argued that this represents a draconian measure against these musical events. And now I'm going to let my friend and colleague Kara talk about the Hungary case.
So I focused on Viktor Orban and his party Fidesz in Hungary. When it comes to the rhetoric surrounding potential opposition groups, there's really no question that Fidesz completely dominates the narrative and criminalizes these groups. Pretty much all media outlets in Hungary currently are either controlled by Fidesz or Fidesz allied individuals. But what we really wanted to look at was how have these narratives actually been put into place and gone beyond just talk used to mobilize people and actual policies in place that seek to criminalize potential opposition. So one thing that Orban has promoted and put into place is what he calls procreation over immigration policies, where he couples strict restrictions on migration and refugees with policies seeking to promote reproduction among native-born Hungarians. And what's particularly interesting about these strict anti-immigration measures and criminalization rhetorically of migrants and other minority groups is the way that he couples this with criminalization of opposition in government and the people that he identifies as global elites. So sort of Orban's main kind of boogeyman is George Soros, who's a Hungarian American who has done a lot to fund pro-democracy and civil society measures in Hungary, and is thus sort of a threat to Orban's power in the country. And therefore, there have been a lot of attempts to villainize and criminalize him. So interestingly, one law that I found that Orban put into place was what he called the Stop Soros law, which made, quote, promoting and supporting illegal migration a crime. What's interesting about this law is that it is deliberately left very vague and open, which means that it can be used pretty arbitrarily to arrest people for things as small as protesting in favor of migrant or refugee rights. And by aligning this with George Soros in some way, he seeks to criminalize both sort of from the bottom up with civilian groups that are potential dissidents, as well as from the top down with individuals such as Soros and opposition parties in a way that allows him to penalize them legally. And as you can see on the right here, I have an image of a billboard. I don't know if you can see that. It says 99% reject illegal immigration. Let's not allow Soros to have the last laugh. So that really demonstrates the way that he attempts to align figures like Soros with migrant communities and criminalize both of them at the same time. And just briefly, I want to do a little comparison of the Orban administration with the Trump administration in the US. As we know, Trump has rhetorically sought to criminalize immigrant and minority groups, primarily by linking these groups with drugs and violent crime. And interestingly, we know that this is not a new strategy in the United States. This was also used by the Nixon administration. An advisor of Nixon's, John Ehrlichman, reportedly holds in an interview that while they knew they could not make it illegal to either be against the war or Black, they could get the public to associate hippies with marijuana and African Americans with heroin, and thus disrupt those communities and arrest their leaders. So the Trump administration has sought to do similar things, and similar to Orban, Trump signed 3 executive orders in 2017, where he reportedly implemented these to, quote, fight crime, gangs, and drugs, restore law and order, and support the dedicated men and women of law enforcement, end quote. And much like the Stop Soros law, in Hungary, many people criticized this law as being deliberately vague in order to make it easier to apply the laws arbitrarily in order to criminalize groups sort of at will. And similarly to the way that the Orban government attempts to criminalize from the bottom up as well as top down, the Trump administration sought to criminalize dissident politicians with the use of language like lock her up, stop the steal, criminalizing language which implies that the Democratic Party, for example, is criminal and villainize them in that way. And as we know, in 2020, Attorney General Barr actually authorized the opening of investigations against election fraud, despite the fact that there was not really any evidence to support this claim. So basically what we see is similar to the Orban administration, that the Trump administration doesn't just use these strategies rhetorically to criminalize, but actually seeks to put these in place and actively penalize people using legal measures. So just to conclude, basically what we wanted to discuss was that there really is evidence that populist parties seek to criminalize dissidents beyond just narrative strategies. So these isn't just rhetoric that they use in order to mobilize the populations, but these are actual, have actual policy outcomes that seek to criminalize legally potential opposition groups. And that they do this from the bottom up with civilian groups, as well as from the top down with potential government dissident groups. And this is something that we think that we should really keep an eye on in Europe going forward, especially as newly elected populist governments enter the forefront, like the new Meloni government in Italy.
If somebody has any question or something I want to discuss.
I can start it off. I had the pleasure of sharing an apartment with Kara and Daniela this last semester, and I remember very clearly the night that this idea of theirs started taking shape. It was really cool to see their enthusiasm and their passion for doing the research and making it work. So good job, girls. I do have a question though. I was just curious if during the course of your research, there was anything that surprised you or something that you didn't expect to see that maybe you'd want to look more into?
I can start to answer this question. One of also another case study that I had was Sweden, and the radical right party, Sweden Democrats, it's not officially in the government, but has signed a political agreement with the main coalition, so with the government, and it's like a 65-page agreement. However, I didn't find until now a policy that like seeks to criminalize some category of people or immigration, for example. But of sure, there is a lot of evidence. They're trying to tighten the immigration policies, something that always characterized Sweden as a welcoming country, and I think it's can be called as a like an indirect, like not direct way to criminalize a group of people. So of course, it becomes more difficult as a migrant to stay in one country. It's kind of like a way of criminalize a group of people. And for sure, immigration is like the most popular kind of topic among these parties. So this is I don't know if Kara has another.
Yeah, I can jump in here. One thing that really surprised me was just how similar approaches were across different potentially populist governments. That was something that I sort of expected, but to the extent that they all sort of seem to follow the same formula, and it seems like they do learn from each other, which I thought was very interesting.
Thank you.
Any other question, or maybe we can move on to the next presentation?
I have a question if there isn't anyone in person that wants to go first. Can I go? Well, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very eye-opening, especially because if I'm correct, one of the presenters is from Italy and then one's from the United States. So it's interesting to see that like the research from people from that location. I have a question, if you have any thoughts on how the increase of populism and how it impacts the law and the public's perception of immigrants and immigration, if that will impact social spending, especially with countries like, you're mentioning Sweden, that is known for having a more robust safety net. And I'm asking that because as you mentioned in the United States with Nixon, all of the, whistleblowing and with that, considering the United States, in addition to that example, I'm thinking about how with integration in the United States, how many cities and communities decided to decrease funding in different public services due to them having to integrate. So I'm wondering whether like the future integration of more immigrants, whether you think that with the populism will result in an impact of like the safety net and social spending of the country. That might be kind of, you probably did not think of that, but that was just, I don't know if you have any thoughts of that, if that question makes sense.
I can definitely speak to Hungary on that one, and I think Daniela will probably have something to say in regards to Sweden, but I think you're definitely right, because we know that in Hungary, Orban has been kind of advocating for increased social services, but particularly for who he defines as real Hungarians or native-born Hungarians, and restricting others, particularly migrants and refugees, from those services. So I think that's absolutely something to be wary of as populism rises across Europe.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can say that in Sweden, as I said before, there is a restriction of also lowering number of immigrants that are like allowed to enter the country. And I can speak about the Italian case. This rhetoric has already been implemented in less funding for example, civil society organization. They're like volunteer in the first line of welcome migrants. And it's also, again, turned out as a criminalization of sea rescue NGOs. And again, there is a similarity between Italy and Hungary. So this demonizing of NGOs or nonprofit organization. And again, this can lead up to the imprisonment of crew members and to the payment of a fine that can go up to 50,000 euros. So of course, there is a lot of policies that are implementing that are like against migrant integration to society.
Thank you so much.
I think we have a question from here, Stephen. I don't know if you.
Do you want me to come up there? Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's
You should just be able to say it from there, actually, there's mics everywhere.
whatever works for you.
Okay, I just don't know if they want to see me.
Yeah, let them see. Sure. This thing.
Okay, hi, that was a really good presentation. I guess my question would be about how I know that in Hungary and the US example, the populist movements are heavily identified with one particular leader, and Italy, Sweden kind of, and I think that in some other countries that have associated with this populism, even Poland, I know you didn't necessarily mention as much, but that's also another European country that's brought up when we're talking about populism. The idea of that one leader of the movement may kind of be more or less there. And I was wondering if you two noticed any differences in these movements based on the prominence of like one particular individual versus kind of the general populist ideas as a whole, and if that changed any sort of like strategy or discourse or anything around it.
I will say in my case, both of mine did seem to be like that, with one particular individual being centered in the movement. But I would say that what I noticed in both of these cases was both Trump and Orban do tend to identify particular individuals as enemies in regards to who they identify as like elites or government enemies. So Orban really focuses a lot on criminalizing Soros, like specifically, and Trump also particularly focused on criminalizing Hillary Clinton, as well as a few others. But that could be a bit of a difference in the sense that where the populist movement has a particular charismatic leader that they center around, they may seek to identify one particular individual as their kind of ultimate enemy, compared to these other more party-centered movements. But I'll see what Daniela has to say about that.
Yeah, I think that in general, we can see there is a tendency toward one figure, like charismatic leader. And this is for sure was the case in Italy, although we have like different radical right parties, and we're always present in our political history. For example, with the current party, Brothers of Italy, one of the main reforms that they promised during the electoral campaign is to introduce a new the figure of a president. So like kind of like in France. And so the idea is to institutionalize this leadership figure. And I think since populism rhetoric is about performance and discursive strategies, I think it's naturally it naturally tend to find a charismatic leader or like a person. I think there's no question here. I don't know if there